July 14, 1944. A dirt road outside Norfolk, Nebraska. The dust rises in slow clouds behind the convoy of olive-drab trucks, turning golden in the afternoon sun. Inside the canvas-covered beds, German prisoners of war sit in silence, their field-gray uniforms faded and patched, their faces weathered by campaigns across North Africa and Italy. Obergefreiter Hans Müller grips the wooden bench beneath him as the truck bounces over ruts in the road, his knuckles white not from the rough ride but from the uncertainty of what comes next. He is 22 years old, captured 3 months earlier during the breakout from the Falaise pocket, and he has been taught since childhood what to expect from the enemies of the Reich. The propaganda films he watched in Hitler youth meetings showed Americans as degenerate gangsters, as a mongrel nation without culture or discipline, as a society on the verge of collapse under the weight of its racial mixing and democratic chaos. The officers who briefed his unit before deployment warned that capture meant torture or execution, that the Americans took no prisoners if they could avoid it, that the lucky ones might expect years of brutal labor in punishment camps where survival was uncertain. Hans has carried these warnings with him through the long journey across the Atlantic in the cramped hold of a transport ship, through the processing center in New York where guards barked orders he barely understood, through the train ride west into the vast interior of America, where the landscape seemed to stretch forever in a way that made his small German village feel like a postage stamp. Now the convoy slows. Through the gap in the canvas, Hans can see they are approaching a town. Small, neat houses with painted shutters and manicured lawns, a main street with shops displaying goods and windows, a water tower in the distance. It looks nothing like the bombed-out rubble of German cities or the dusty chaos of the Italian front. It looks peaceful, prosperous, untouched by war. The truck stops at an intersection, waiting for a farm vehicle to pass. And then Hans sees something that makes his breath catch in his throat. A group of children, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, stand on the sidewalk with their bicycles. They are watching the convoy with undisguised curiosity, and as the truck idles at the intersection, one child, a girl with blonde braids, raises her hand and waves. Not a gesture of mockery or hatred, but a simple, innocent wave of greeting. Then another child waves, and another. Within seconds, all the children are waving at the German prisoners, their faces showing nothing but friendly interest, the casual goodwill of children who see strangers and instinctively offer acknowledgement. Hans stares at the waving children, his mind struggling to process what he is seeing. This is not supposed to happen. The enemy's children are not supposed to wave at prisoners. They are supposed to throw stones, to curse, to reflect the hatred that total war demands. But these American children wave as if the prisoners are merely visitors, as if uniforms and nationality matter less than basic human courtesy. Hans realizes his hands are trembling. Several other prisoners have crowded to the gap in the canvas, watching the children wave, and the silence in the truck has taken on a different quality. No longer the silence of apprehension, but the silence of people witnessing something that contradicts everything they have been told to believe. The truck moves forward. The children disappear behind the canvas, but the image remains, seared into Hans Müller's consciousness with a power that will echo through the rest of his life. In that moment, something fundamental shifts. Not dramatically, not completely, but enough to crack the shell of certainty he has worn since boyhood. If the children wave, if they show no hatred, if they see not enemies but merely people, then what else might be different from what he has been taught? What else might be a lie? The architecture of expectation, to understand the profound impact that waving children had on German prisoners of war arriving in America, we must first understand the comprehensive system of indoctrination that had shaped their worldview. The Nazi regime had spent more than a decade constructing a complete mythology about Germany's enemies, particularly about the United States, that chaotic experiment in democracy, that melting pot of inferior races, that society supposedly rotting from within despite its superficial prosperity. From the earliest days of Nazi rule in 1933, German children were immersed in propaganda that portrayed the world in stark racial and ideological terms. The Hitler Youth, which became mandatory in 1936, taught that Germans belonged to a master race destined to rule over inferior peoples. The curriculum in schools was rewritten to emphasize racial science, to glorify military virtues, to present history as an endless struggle between strong nations that took what they needed and weak nations that were conquered and deserved their fate. Every aspect of German society reinforced these messages. The newspapers, the radio broadcasts, the films, the public speeches that echoed from loudspeakers in every town square. America occupied a special place in this propaganda architecture. It was presented as both contemptible and dangerous. Contemptible because of its racial mixing and democratic disorder. Dangerous because of its industrial capacity and geographic isolation from European conflicts. Nazi propagandists mocked American culture as shallow and materialistic, derided American soldiers as poorly trained civilians playing at war, portrayed American society as on the verge of collapse from internal contradictions. Jews and communists secretly controlled America, the propaganda insisted, manipulating a naive population for their own ends. The real Americans, the descendants of German and Nordic immigrants, were oppressed by this corrupt system and would welcome liberation if German forces ever reached their shores. This narrative served multiple purposes. It bolstered German morale by portraying enemies as weak and divided. It provided a scapegoat for any German setbacks. If America's industrial production tipped the scales, it was because of unfair material advantages, not because of any genuine virtue in the American system. And crucially, it prepared German soldiers psychologically for the possibility of capture by framing it as a fate potentially worse than death. German soldiers were told that if they fell into American hands, they could expect brutal treatment at best, execution at worst, and certainly nothing resembling the protections of the Geneva Conventions. Obergefreiter Hans Müller had absorbed all of this. Born in 1922, he was 11 years old when Hitler came to power, 14 when war began. His entire adolescence had been shaped by Nazi ideology, by the Hitler youth camps where he learned to march and shoot and obey without question, by the rallies where thousands of voices chanted in unison, and the sense of belonging to something powerful and inevitable filled him with purpose. He had volunteered for military service at 18, had fought in Italy with a sense that he was defending civilization against its enemies, had been wounded twice and decorated for bravery. Even as the war turned against Germany, even as the defeats mounted and the promises of final victory rang increasingly hollow, Hans had maintained his fundamental beliefs about who was right and who was wrong, who was strong and who was weak. Then he was captured. The moment of surrender had been chaotic. His unit surrounded, ammunition exhausted, officers dead or fled, the survivors raising hands and white cloths in that universal gesture of submission. The American soldiers who took them prisoner had been professional but not particularly friendly, herding the Germans into collection points with efficient impersonality. Some Americans had shown casual kindness, sharing cigarettes, offering water, but others had been harsh, suspicious, treating the prisoners with the wariness of men who had lost friends to German weapons. Hans had not known what to expect, but he had braced himself for the worst. The worst had not come. Instead, there had been food, not gourmet meals, but regular rations, adequate portions, hot coffee. There had been medical attention for the wounded. There had been processing, documentation, the bureaucratic machinery of a nation that apparently kept careful records even of its enemies. And then there had been the long journey to America, across an Atlantic where German U-boats had once hunted with impunity, but now were largely swept from the seas, to a nation so vast and so secure that it could house hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners, far from any possible rescue or liberation. Hans had expected prison camps to be harsh places of punishment and deprivation. He had expected to be met with hatred by American civilians whose newspapers reported German atrocities, and whose sons died fighting the Wehrmacht. He had not expected children to wave. The reality of arrival by the summer of 1944, the United States held approximately 200,000 German prisoners of war on American soil, a number that would grow to nearly 380,000 by the war's end. These prisoners were dispersed across hundreds of camps throughout the country, from Texas to Wisconsin, from California to Virginia. The camps varied in size and conditions, but all operated under guidelines established by the Geneva Conventions and monitored by the International Red Cross and Swiss protecting powers. The United States had decided, as a matter of both international law and strategic calculation, to treat prisoners well, not out of sentimentality, but because proper treatment encouraged surrender, provided useful labor, and demonstrated to the world that America fought according to civilized standards even when its enemies did not. The result was a prisoner of war system that shocked German soldiers who had been taught to expect brutality. Camps provided adequate food, sometimes better than what German civilians were eating under rationing back home. Prisoners received pay for their labor, albeit at reduced rates. They were allowed to send and receive mail through neutral channels. They could organize recreational activities, sports leagues, theatrical productions, educational classes. The more cooperative prisoners were assigned work details on farms and in food processing facilities, addresses the severe labor shortage created by American mobilization, while allowing prisoners to earn small amounts of money and break the monotony of camp life. This was not paradise. Camps were Spartan, discipline could be strict, and the loss of freedom weighed heavily. Some camps were poorly administered, some guards were harsh, and conflicts between prisoners, between Nazi loyalists and anti-Nazi dissidents, between officers and enlisted men, between those who cooperated with authorities and those who resisted, could turn violent. But by the standards of wartime imprisonment, by comparison to the conditions that Allied prisoners endured in German camps and especially Japanese camps, the treatment of Axis prisoners in America was remarkably humane. What truly disoriented German prisoners, however, was not the material conditions of their imprisonment but their encounters with ordinary Americans. The propaganda had prepared them for a nation consumed by hatred, for civilians who would spit on prisoners and demand vengeance. Instead, prisoners discovered a population that seemed largely indifferent to their presence, that treated them with a casual pragmatism that was somehow more unsettling than either kindness or cruelty would have been. American farmers whose German prisoner work details needed men to harvest crops, treated prisoners as temporary employees, supervising them but also sometimes eating lunch alongside them, discussing crop yields and weather with the matter-of-fact focus of people more concerned with practical outcomes than ideological purity. Guards at camps ranged from professional but distant to actively friendly, some learning German to communicate better, others sharing photographs of their own families and asking prisoners about life in Germany. Civilians in towns near camps often viewed prisoners with curiosity rather than hostility, children especially showing the unfiltered interest that the young display toward anything unfamiliar. The waving was everywhere. In towns across the Midwest and South, in rural areas where prisoner work details traveled to farms, German POWs reported the same phenomenon. American children would wave at them. Not always, not universally. Some communities maintained a harder edge of hostility, especially those that had lost sons to the war, but often enough that it became a common experience, shared by prisoners in conversations, written about in letters home, remembered decades later as a moment when the enemy's face suddenly became human. Hans Müller, arriving at Camp Atlanta in Nebraska, a branch camp housing about 300 prisoners who worked primarily in sugar beet harvesting and food processing, experienced this directly. The camp was located just outside Norfolk, a town of about 11,000 people, and prisoners working on farm details regularly traveled through town or past farms where families lived. And regularly children waved, not with elaborate ceremony, not with any apparent instruction from adults, but with the spontaneous friendliness that characterized American children raised in a culture that valued outward cheerfulness and democratic informality. For Hans, each wave was a small wound to his certainty. The first time could be dismissed as an aberration, a single unusual child, but it kept happening, and each time it happened, the contradiction between what he had been taught to expect and what he was experiencing grew more difficult to ignore. The symbolism of the wave, that simple gesture of raised hand and moving fingers, became for German prisoners a symbol far more powerful than its physical simplicity might suggest. It represented everything that Nazi ideology had insisted was impossible, that the enemy might be generous rather than cruel, that a democratic society might be strong rather than weak, that people of mixed racial backgrounds might be prosperous and secure rather than degenerate and chaotic, that children raised without authoritarian discipline might be kind rather than feral. In the Nazi worldview, strength came from hardness, from the willingness to dominate or be dominated, from the understanding that the world was a zero-sum struggle, where one race's gain was another's loss. Kindness was weakness. Generosity was foolishness. The treatment of enemies should reflect their status as obstacles to be removed or resources to be exploited. This framework had justified every atrocity the regime committed, if the enemy was not really human, or if their suffering was necessary for German greatness. Then cruelty was not a moral failing but a necessary tool. American children waving at German prisoners contradicted all of this. The children were not weak. They were well-fed, healthy, confident, products of a society that had not suffered invasion or sustained bombing. Their families were not oppressed. They lived in houses with electricity and indoor plumbing, drove automobiles, had access to schools and churches, and the full range of American consumer culture even in wartime. The community was not chaotic. The towns were orderly, the roads well-maintained, the institutions functional. And yet, despite having every reason to hate German soldiers, despite the daily newspaper reports of American casualties in Europe, these children waved with casual friendliness, as if prisoners were merely strangers deserving of ordinary courtesy. The wave said, "You are human even though we are at war." The wave said, "Our strength does not require your dehumanization." The wave said, "We can defeat you militarily while maintaining our own sense of decency." These were not messages that Nazi ideology had prepared German soldiers to receive. Gefreiter Karl Schneider, who served in the same camp as Hans Müller, later wrote about the experience in a memoir published in the 1970s. The waving children haunted me. I would lie in my bunk at night and think about them. In Germany, we had been taught that children must be hardened, that they must learn early to distinguish friend from enemy, that weakness and sentiment were dangerous luxuries. The Hitler Youth trained us to be warriors from the age of 10. We learned to shoot, to march, to obey without question. We were told this was necessary because the world was harsh and only the strong survived. But these American children waved at us, at prisoners, at enemies, and they seemed happier than we had ever been. They seemed free in a way we had never been free. And I began to wonder whether the hardness we had been taught was strength or simply cruelty, disguised as virtue. The transformation of certainty. The impact of these encounters was not immediate or universal. Many German prisoners clung to their Nazi beliefs throughout their captivity, dismissed friendly gestures as propaganda or deception, maintained that Germany was losing the war only because of material disadvantage, rather than any moral or systemic failing. Prison camps often had tensions between committed Nazis and those who began to question or openly reject the ideology, with Nazi true believers sometimes violently enforcing conformity among fellow prisoners. But for a significant number of prisoners, the gap between what they had been taught and what they experienced created cognitive dissonance that could not be indefinitely ignored. The evidence was too consistent, too undeniable. America was not on the verge of collapse, it was thriving. Americans were not degenerate, they were healthier and better fed than Germans. Democracy was not weak. It had mobilized a military force that was systematically dismantling the Wehrmacht across multiple continents. And American civilians, rather than being consumed with hatred, often treated prisoners with a casualness that suggested they saw the war as a task to be completed, rather than an existential struggle requiring total commitment of emotion and identity. The U.S. military, recognizing the opportunity this created, established re-education programs for German prisoners. These programs, which began in earnest in 1944, exposed prisoners to American history, democratic principles, free press, and evidence of Nazi crimes. Prisoners were shown films, given access to German-language newspapers printed by American authorities, encouraged to attend lectures and discussions. The goal was not crude propaganda, but rather exposure to alternative perspectives that might crack the shell of indoctrination. The programs had mixed success. Committed Nazis resisted, sometimes violently, but for prisoners who were already questioning, who had seen American children wave and wondered what that meant, the programs provided a framework for reconsidering their assumptions. Hans Müller attended educational sessions partly out of boredom, camp life was monotonous and any activity was welcome, and partly out of genuine curiosity. He watched films about the American Revolution and the Civil War, learning about a nation that had fought wars to establish independence and end slavery, that had traditions of questioning authority and protecting individual rights. He read German-language accounts of concentration camps being liberated by Allied forces, initially dismissing these as propaganda, then gradually acknowledging that the specificity and consistency of the reports made dismissal increasingly difficult. He participated in discussion groups where prisoners debated what had gone wrong, why Germany had lost, whether the cause had been just. And through all of this, the image of waving children remained with him, a touchstone of something fundamentally different between the society that had raised him and the society that had defeated him. The transformation was not sudden conversion but gradual erosion of certainty. Nazi ideology had demanded absolute conviction, had insisted that any doubt was betrayal. But doubt once admitted spreads. If the children wave, then maybe Americans are not monsters. If Americans are not monsters, then maybe the propaganda was false. If the propaganda about America was false, what else might be false? If the regime lied about the enemy, might it have lied about other things, about the necessity of war, about who started it, about the crimes committed in Germany's name? By the time Hans Müller returned to Germany in 1946, released after 2 years in American captivity, he was not a convert to democracy or an anti-Nazi crusader. He was simply a young man whose certainties had been shattered, who no longer knew what to believe, who had seen enough contradictions to question everything. He returned to a Germany that was occupied, divided, and devastated. His hometown partially destroyed by bombing, his family scattered, his nation stripped of sovereignty and facing an uncertain future, the evidence of abundance. The children's waves were not the only symbol that challenged German prisoners' preconceptions, but they were perhaps the most emotionally powerful. The sheer material abundance of America, however, provided the most comprehensive refutation of Nazi ideology. German soldiers had been told that democracies were decadent and weak, that racial mixing produced inferior societies, that only authoritarian discipline could create national greatness. Then they arrived in America and saw that this supposedly inferior society had living standards that exceeded anything in Germany, industrial capacity that dwarfed German production, and a casualness about its wealth that suggested resources so abundant that waste was inconsequential. Camp food, while not luxurious, exceeded German rations. Prisoners received approximately 4,000 calories per day, more than German civilians were receiving by 1944, more than German soldiers were receiving in many combat zones. The food was plain but adequate: bread, meat, vegetables, coffee, sometimes desserts. Prisoners working on farms often received additional food from farmers who needed their labor and understood that well-fed workers were more productive. The contrast with conditions in Germany, where rationing had become increasingly severe and the ersatz substitutes increasingly inedible, was stark. American guards casually displayed wealth that would have seemed extravagant in Germany. They smoked cigarettes freely, an unimaginable luxury in tobacco-starved Germany where a single cigarette could be traded for a meal. They drove automobiles, wore wristwatches, complained about the quality of camp food even though that food was better than what most German soldiers had eaten. Some guards showed prisoners photographs of their homes, modest by American standards but astonishing to Germans, houses with lawns and garages and multiple bedrooms, evidence of a working-class prosperity that had no equivalent in Germany. Prisoners working on American farms saw mechanization that made German agriculture look medieval by comparison. American farmers used tractors where Germans still relied heavily on horse-drawn equipment. The fields were vast, the yields abundant, the casual waste shocking. Hans Müller worked on a sugar beet farm in Nebraska and watched as a farmer discarded produce that was perfectly edible but cosmetically imperfect, a level of waste that would have been criminal in food-scarce Germany but was apparently routine in America. The farmer, noticing Hans's shock, simply shrugged and explained that it was cheaper to discard imperfect produce than to spend labor sorting and processing it, an economic calculation that revealed an abundance so profound that efficiency trumped scarcity. The statistics supported what prisoners saw anecdotally. In 1944, American industrial production exceeded that of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American factories produced 96,000 aircraft that year compared to Germany's 39,000. American shipyards launched more tonnage in a single year than Japan produced during the entire war. American farms fed not just the U.S. military and civilian population, but provided substantial quantities of food to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies through Lend-Lease. This was not the output of a decadent, failing society, but of an economic system operating at peak efficiency, mobilized for war but not consumed by it, able to produce both guns and butter in quantities that made German production look inadequate. German prisoners writing letters that were censored but still carried information, tried to explain what they were seeing. The letters are remarkable documents, full of attempts to reconcile propaganda with reality. "The Americans have so much," one prisoner wrote to his family in Bavaria. "I do not understand how they can be so rich. We were told they were on the verge of collapse, but I see no sign of it. Even here in prison camp we eat better than I remember eating before the war." What does this mean? Were we lied to about everything? The psychology of cognitive dissonance psychologists, studying German prisoners of war, during and after their captivity in America, documented a phenomenon they termed belief collapse, the psychological crisis that occurs when deeply held convictions are confronted with irrefutable contradictory evidence. Nazi ideology had demanded total commitment, had structured its adherents' entire understanding of the world around certain fundamental premises. When those premises were revealed as false, the resulting psychological distress could be severe. Some prisoners responded with denial, insisting that what they saw was elaborate deception, that American abundance was temporary or artificial, that Germany would still achieve final victory through secret weapons or diplomatic realignments. These prisoners clung to their beliefs with increasing desperation as the evidence mounted against them. They sometimes formed groups within camps to enforce ideological conformity, intimidating or attacking prisoners who expressed doubts. Other prisoners experienced profound depression, losing the sense of meaning and purpose that Nazi ideology had provided. If the cause had been false, if the sacrifices had been for nothing, if the nation they had fought for had committed the atrocities that evidence increasingly suggested, then what had their lives meant? Some prisoners withdrew into themselves, became listless and unresponsive, lost interest in the educational programs and recreational activities that camps offered. But many prisoners, perhaps the majority, gradually adapted to the new reality. They did not necessarily embrace American values or democracy. Nationalism and cultural identity run deep, but they acknowledged that they had been lied to, that the Nazi regime had been criminal, that Germany needed to change. The process was neither quick nor easy. It involved confronting shame, guilt, and the loss of identity that comes from discovering that the cause you fought for was unjust. The children waving served as a catalyst for this process. The gesture was too simple, too innocent to be explained away as propaganda or deception. Children were not sophisticated enough to participate in elaborate psychological warfare. Their waves were genuine expressions of curiosity and friendliness, reflections of a culture that had taught them to be outgoing and democratic in their interactions. And if the children could wave, if they could see past nationality and uniform to the humans underneath, then perhaps the prisoners could do the same, could acknowledge that the American enemy was also human, that the war had been fought for false reasons, that a different way of organizing society was not only possible, but might be preferable. The letters and memories after the war, many former prisoners published memoirs or gave interviews about their experiences in American captivity. These accounts, collected and analyzed by historians, provide a window into the psychological impact of that experience. A recurring theme is the disconnect between expectation and reality, and the symbolic importance of small gestures like children waving. Helmut Herner, captured in North Africa and imprisoned in Texas, wrote, "I expected to be treated as we treated Russian prisoners, worked to death, starved, beaten. Instead, I was fed, housed, given medical care when I was ill. I worked on a cotton farm, and the farmers' children would sometimes come to watch us work. They were curious, asked questions through translators, once brought lemonade on a hot day. I could not reconcile this with what I had been taught about American ruthlessness. Slowly, over months, I came to understand that I had been lied to about many things, perhaps about everything." Georg Gertner, who escaped from a POW camp in 1945 and lived illegally in America for 40 years before voluntarily surrendering in 1985, described the experience of seeing American prosperity firsthand. In the camp, we received magazines and newspapers. Even propaganda couldn't hide the reality in the photographs, the advertisements for products, the images of ordinary American homes, the evidence of wealth that was widespread rather than concentrated among elites. And when we worked outside the camp, we saw this directly. America was everything Germany claimed to be but wasn't: strong, prosperous, confident. The children who waved at us were not taught to hate. This was more subversive than any political speech could have been. The waves, mentioned again and again in these accounts, served as a Rorschach test revealing what prisoners brought to the encounter. Those determined to maintain Nazi beliefs interpreted the waves as naivety, as evidence that Americans didn't understand the seriousness of war, as weakness that Germany would ultimately exploit. But those open to questioning saw something else: evidence that strength and decency were not incompatible, that a society could fight effectively while maintaining humanitarian values, that the either-or choice between hardness and weakness was a false dichotomy created by totalitarian ideology. The post-war reckoning. Hans Müller returned to Germany in 1946 to find a nation unrecognizable from the one he had left. The Third Reich that had promised 1,000 years had lasted 12. The cities were rubble, the economy collapsed, the population traumatized. Germany was divided into occupation zones, its sovereignty suspended, its future uncertain. The revelations about concentration camps and the Holocaust, which prisoners in America had heard about but many had dismissed as propaganda, were now undeniable, documented by mountains of evidence and the testimony of survivors. Hans struggled to rebuild his life. He found work in construction, helping clear rubble and rebuild buildings in his hometown. He married a woman who had also lived through the war, whose family had lost members to the bombing and the fighting. They did not talk much about their wartime experiences. The subject was too painful, too complicated, too laden with guilt and shame. But occasionally, late at night, Hans would tell her about America, about the camps, about the abundance he had seen. And he would tell her about the children who waved. They waved at us, he would say, his voice still carrying a note of wonder years later. We were the enemy. We had fought for a regime that had brought death to millions, and these children waved. They did not know enough to hate, or perhaps they knew enough not to hate. I think about them often. I wonder if they remember the German prisoners they waved at. I wonder if they know what their simple gesture meant, how it undermined everything we had been taught, how it suggested that a different way of living was possible. Hans became a quiet supporter of German reconstruction and democratization. He voted in the first elections of the Federal Republic, supported the new constitution with its guarantees of human rights, raised his own children to question authority and think for themselves. He never became a political activist or a philosopher of democracy. He remained an ordinary man, a construction worker and father, someone whose life was defined more by daily routines than grand ideologies. But he carried with him always the memory of children waving, and the knowledge that this simple gesture had planted seeds of doubt that eventually blossomed into different understanding. The larger truth, the story of German prisoners of war in America, of children waving at enemies, of expectations shattered by reality, speaks to fundamental questions about ideology, propaganda, and the nature of societal systems. Nazi Germany had built an elaborate mythology about racial superiority, about the necessity of authoritarian control, about the weakness and degeneracy of democratic societies. This mythology was not just abstract theory, but was woven into every aspect of German life, shaping education and culture and law. The mythology failed not because it was argued against, but because reality refuted it. German soldiers expected to find in America the chaos and weakness that propaganda had promised. Instead, they found order and abundance. They expected hatred and cruelty. Instead, they found pragmatic decency and children who waved. They expected a society on the verge of collapse. Instead, they found a nation so secure and prosperous that it could afford to treat its enemies well, that saw no contradiction between fighting a war and maintaining humanitarian standards. This is the power of systems over ideology, of reality over propaganda. Totalitarian regimes can control information, can shape education, can punish dissent and create environments where questioning is dangerous, but they cannot indefinitely shield their citizens from observable reality. When German prisoners saw American abundance with their own eyes, when they experienced humane treatment despite being enemies, when children waved at them with casual friendliness, the propaganda lost its power. Not immediately, not universally, but sufficiently to plant doubt that ideology alone could never overcome. The wave, that simple gesture of hand raised in greeting, became a symbol of the difference between societies that trust their citizens and societies that control them, between systems that teach hatred and systems that teach openness, between nations that define strength as domination and nations that understand strength can coexist with decency. The children who waved were not making political statements. They were simply being American children, raised in a culture that valued friendliness and democratic informality, that taught them to see individuals rather than collective enemies. Epilogue. The Testament of Waves. There is a photograph in the Nebraska State Historical Society archives, taken in the summer of 1944, showing a group of German prisoners working in a sugar beet field near Norfolk. In the background, almost incidental to the main composition, two children stand by a fence, and though the photograph's resolution is too poor to be certain, it appears that one of them is waving. The photograph is unremarkable in most respects, just one of thousands, documenting the prisoner of war program. But it captures a moment that thousands of German prisoners experienced and remembered for the rest of their lives. Hans Müller died in 1998, in the same German town where he had been born 76 years earlier. His children found among his possessions a small notebook in which he had written, in the careful script of someone who had learned to write with a fountain pen, his memories of captivity in America. Most of the entries were mundane, descriptions of work details, camp routines, fellow prisoners. But one entry, dated August 1944, read simply, "Today the children waved again. I do not understand this. I do not know what it means. But I cannot forget it. That inability to forget, that nagging persistence of an experience that contradicted everything he had been taught, was the beginning of Hans Müller's journey from certainty to doubt, from ideology to pragmatism, from blind loyalty to thoughtful citizenship. It was not a dramatic conversion but a slow erosion, a gradual recognition that the world was more complicated than propaganda suggested, that enemies could be human, that strength and kindness were not mutually exclusive. The children who waved in Nebraska and Texas, in Wisconsin and Virginia, and dozens of other places where German prisoners worked and lived during those war years, did not know they were participating in an ideological struggle. They were simply being children, greeting strangers the way their culture had taught them to greet people. But their waves carried a message more powerful than any political speech, any propaganda film, any ideological argument, that democracy produces abundance, that free societies can be strong, that decency is not weakness but a different kind of strength. German prisoners who experienced American captivity, who saw their expectations proven false by daily reality, who watched children wave and struggled to reconcile that simple gesture with everything they had believed. These prisoners returned to Germany carrying seeds of doubt that helped inoculate post-war German society against the return of totalitarianism. Not all prisoners were changed. Not all questioning led to genuine transformation. But enough were affected that the experience mattered, that it contributed to the broader process by which Germany confronted its past and built a different future. The wave endures in memory and meaning, a gesture of innocence that became a weapon against ideology, a symbol of abundance that spoke louder than scarcity's justifications for cruelty, a reminder that how we treat enemies reveals more about our own values than about their worth. Children waved at German prisoners because American culture, for all its flaws and contradictions, had taught them that people were people before they were enemies, that courtesy cost nothing and kindness was a reflex not requiring justification. And in that wave, in that simple raising of a child's hand, lay a truth that totalitarianism could not counter and propaganda could not disguise, that freedom works, that abundance is possible, that societies organized around human dignity rather than racial mythology can be strong and prosperous and secure. That truth, witnessed by thousands of German prisoners, remembered across lifetimes, whispered to children and grandchildren as a story about the strange experience of captivity in America, became part of the foundation upon which a new Germany was built. Not through conquest or ideology, but through the slow, Patient recognition that there was another way to live, another way to organize society, another way to be human. The children waved, and the gesture echoed across decades, a simple testament to the power of decency over hatred, of abundance over scarcity, of freedom over control. They waved. These American children and German soldiers who had expected monsters found humans instead. And that discovery, more than any military defeat or political negotiation, marked the true end of the Nazi dream and the beginning of something different, imperfect, uncertain but human in a way that totalitarianism had forbidden humanity to be.